Why ancient Carthaginians believed elephants enjoyed perfume, polytubes, and perfumed politics. 1,500 to 2,000 words. Imagine, if you will, a warm Carthaginian morning in the 3rd century BCE. The sun has only just crested the clay-colored hills, spilling light across the port city's stone roads. The sea smells faintly of salt and pine resin, and somewhere inland, a strange scent hangs in the air, a blend of crushed myrrh, cedar oil, and something sweet, like fig syrup warmed under linen. You're standing in the outer court of a Carthaginian military estate, and trotting toward you, slowly but proudly, is a war elephant, not dusty or wild, but carefully bathed. Behind him, a servant carrying a bronze jar pours oil along the elephant's back, while another rubs a cloth saturated in aromatic paste along its ears and tusks. To the Carthaginians, this wasn't merely for show. They believed elephants, their prized, terrifying tools of war, enjoyed the scent of perfume, not in a metaphorical or symbolic sense, but in a practical one. Perfume, they thought, calmed the elephant. It reminded the creature of familiar, comforting things. It steadied their breath even before battle. Why would anyone believe this? The answer lies in a quiet intersection of ancient science, superstition, and logistics. A place where animal training, military planning, and old ideas about the senses converged. The scented army Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, whose name still echoes in Roman nightmares, didn't just lead elephants across the Alps. He oversaw their grooming. Roman sources and later Arab commentators describe Carthaginian stables, where war elephants were not only trained, but kept in shaded, scented quarters. Resinous woods were burned like incense. Elephants were sometimes rubbed with pastes of myrtle or pine oils. And in especially wealthy units, these treatments extended to full aromatic routines. Lemon balm near the eyes, cedar oil down the spine, and even perfumed wrappings around the tusks. These weren't just aesthetic rituals. There was a widely shared belief in ancient Mediterranean cultures, inherited from Egyptian and Near Eastern traditions, that scent had psychological effects on animals. The idea wasn't entirely without precedent. The Egyptians, long before, the Carthaginians had perfumed their animal mummies. Some scholars believe they used scent to calm sacred bulls or feline temple animals. It's even possible that early African elephant handlers noticed how the creatures responded to certain smells in the wild, perhaps avoiding bitter resins but lingering near citrus groves or date palms. That, in turn, may have shaped beliefs about scent preferences, but Carthage took it further. Scent became part of military readiness, training the untrainable like horses or dogs. Elephants don't respond well to sudden noises, flames, or loud commands, but they can learn through scent association. Ancient trainers likely discovered that certain smells helped reinforce routines, not unlike modern trainers using clickers and treats, a balm applied before feeding, a certain oil used during bathing. Over time, the elephant might associate these with calm or comfort. And when you're about to send a 5-ton animal into battle, preferably not running backward, you want them calm, not panicked. Some surviving Carthaginian trade records preserved in Roman copies list imports of balsam, frankincense, and myrrh, not just for temples, but for stable use. These notes sit beside more mundane entries for barley and rope, suggesting that aromatic resins were, at least occasionally, part of day-to-day military provisioning. We even have evidence from early Roman veterinarians like Vegetes, who suggested scented compresses for treating distressed war animals. Although by then the practice was already fading into antiquity. Not just for the elephants, there's another theory. 2. The perfume wasn't just for the elephants, it was for the men. Imagine being a Carthaginian soldier walking beside a beast whose flank is taller than your tent. You're tired, maybe barefoot, and the Alps are ahead. But the elephant smells like home, like the oils used in the bathhouse your grandmother took you to, like the temple where you left offerings. The scent calms you as much as the beast. You begin to believe, perhaps irrationally, that this elephant understands you, that it's not just an animal, it's a partner, and this illusion, this perfume-induced comfort might be just enough to make you march on. The social scent of Carthage was a city of scents. Aromatics were part of civic life. Temple rituals used perfume and incense daily. Upper-class citizens bathed with scented oils. Even public spaces had censers or perfumed fountains. This emphasis on scent wasn't unique, but it was particularly pronounced in Carthaginian culture, possibly inherited from Phoenician ancestry and bolstered by North African resin trade routes. 2. The Carthaginians. Scent was more than hygiene. It was spiritual. It was emotional. It marked boundaries between sacred and profane. And in the case of war elephants, it marked the boundary between chaos and control. The battle of the smells. It's worth pausing to consider what the enemy smelled. To the Romans, elephants were a kind of monstrous affront, loud, unfamiliar, terrifying. But perhaps, just perhaps, they also noticed the scent. Balsam before. To them, the perfume may have seemed mystical, intimidating, otherworldly. A calm elephant is one thing. A calm, perfumed elephant moving like a mountain in armor. That was psychological warfare. Fading traces, no Carthaginian war elephant handlers. Journal has survived. Most of what we know is reconstructed from Roman accounts, archaeological finds, and a great deal of scholarly inference. But the traces remain in Roman veterinary manuals, in trade records, and even in a few Arabic texts from centuries later, which speak of elephants trained with oil and scent, not lash. It may seem minor, a detail lost in the margins of larger wars, but sometimes history lives in those margins. Sometimes it's the scent left behind. The keepers of giants and the fragrance of logistics you may think the great challenge was simply the battle. The thunder of hooves, the clash of metal, the rumble of elephants charging down a narrow pass. But the real difficulty came before the trumpet ever sounded. The true test of a Carthaginian war elephant's value was not bravery or size or even perfume. It was survival. Imagine you are a handler, a mahout tasked with caring for one of these massive animals. Your title might not be recorded in stone, but without you, the elephant would starve, panic, or fall from a cliff before it ever reached the battlefield. And you, quietly walking alongside its flank, armed with a bronze spike and a pouch of fig paste, are its closest companion. This section is about you, the keepers of giants, and the painstaking, fragrant logistics of making elephant warfare possible, feeding the beast, the average Carthaginian war elephant, most likely a North African forest elephant, now extinct, stood about 2.5 meters tall and could weigh between 2.5 and 4 tons. It consumed up to 150 kilograms of food per day and drank over 100 liters of water, depending on temperature and terrain. That meant every elephant on the march required its own logistical tail, multiple men, several pack animals, and an entire system of provisioning. The elephants could graze, but not effectively in enemy territory or mountainous passes. So handlers packed compressed feed, grain cakes, dried reeds, and bundles of preserved grasses. Sometimes aromatic herbs were mixed into these feed cakes, not out of indulgence, but to prevent spoilage and possibly even reduce parasites. Thyme, mint, and occasionally crushed pine resin were recorded in surviving Punic agricultural texts, used as preservatives. In short, perfumed food wasn't just for nobility, it traveled on 4 legs. The portable bathhouse keeping an elephant clean while on the march was not just a matter of hygiene. It was necessary to prevent disease, saddle sores, and parasitic infections. Elephants were bathed as often as water sources allowed. But when full baths weren't possible, handlers used rags soaked in herbal infusions to wipe down the elephant's most sensitive areas behind the ears, under the belly, around the eyes. Some of these infusions doubled as insect repellents. One common mixture mentioned in Roman veterinary notes included myrrh, cedarwood oil, and crushed fig leaves. All three had antiparasitic properties and were believed to soothe irritated skin. They also happened to smell rather pleasant, aromatic. Cleansing was thus not entirely ritual. It had a genuine, if primitive, medicinal purpose. Still, as the march dragged on, supplies would dwindle. Carthaginian commanders often prioritized perfume oils in the same shipments as medicinal salves. They were used interchangeably, one to calm, one to treat. Both, it seems, were essential scent. As memory, now imagine the elephant itself. Modern studies suggest elephants possess highly developed olfactory memory. They can remember the smell of distant relatives, favorite fruits, and even human handlers decades later. It's not unreasonable to believe that. Carthaginian handlers noticed this, too. By using consistent scents during feeding, grooming, and training, they were possibly encoding routines through smell. The application of lemon balm might signal feeding time. The scent of frankincense might accompany rest. Cedar oil might signal movement or readiness. This kind of primitive, scent-based conditioning may explain why perfume became so entwined with elephant care. It wasn't simply decorative, it was a codebook, a quiet language of scent between handler and beast. The emotional labor of an elephant. Elephant handlers were not high-ranking officers. They were often drawn from lower classes, skilled, patient, and almost invisible in the military hierarchy. Few are named in the records, but their role was indispensable. They slept near their elephants. They walked beside them during campaigns. They bore the responsibility not only of feeding and bathing the animal, but also keeping it calm in moments of danger. Some texts suggest handlers used chanting or humming to soothe elephants. Others mention talismans or charms often tied to the animal's harness, bits of polished stone, dyed cloth, or small pouches of herb bundles. These were not religious relics in the formal sense. They were comfort objects for the animal and perhaps the human to dot in this quiet companionship. Perfume played yet another role. It masked the scent of fear. Both man and beast were frightened, but wrapped in familiar smells with routine, motions, and the balm-slicked cloth in hand. They could proceed. When perfume fails, of course, even with these efforts, elephants were not machines. They could panic. And when they did, the consequences were deadly, often more for the Carthaginians than their enemies. Roman accounts speak of elephants turning back on their own lines when frightened. The Battle of Zama, 202 BCE, in which Hannibal faced defeat at the hands of Scipio Africanus, is often cited as a turning point, not least because many of Hannibal's elephants, once so vital, failed to break the Roman lines and instead caused disarray among Carthage's own forces. Historians speculate that Roman trumpeters used loud, discordant blasts to frighten the elephants. The sound, unfamiliar and piercing, overwhelmed any comfort the perfume could offer. In such moments, no balm or chant could hold the creature. A terrified elephant became a force of chaos, crushing infantry and ignoring all attempts to redirect it. This was the dark side of perfume-based control. It worked only when nothing else failed. It could soothe, but not override instinct. The scent trail of Empire Revan after Carthage fell, echoes of its elephant handling practices survived. Roman authors like Pliny the Elder wrote about elephants being soothed by scent. Later, Byzantine sources mention the use of oils in treating beasts of burden and war. In Arabic veterinary texts from the 9th and 10th centuries, references to scent-based elephant calming appear again, though by then, war elephants had become increasingly rare. What endured was the idea that smell shaped memory, shaped behavior. Perhaps this is one of the quiet legacies of Carthage, not its fire, its ships, or its silver, but the knowledge passed hand to hand among animal keepers, whispering between citrus trees and oil jars. The belief that even the largest animal could be calmed by a fragrance. A legacy that rode not on chariots, but in sachets of crushed myrrh. But what happened when the elephants arrived at their destination, battle-ready, perfumed, and exhausted? What did they see, and how did the opposing armies react to these massive, fragrant creatures? The fragrant charge and the long goodbye, morning of battle, arrived, not with sudden drums or dramatic speeches, but with a slow rising mist and the heavy clank of armor being tightened. Men stirred from their makeshift tents. Spears were passed from hand to hand. Shields were checked, even polished, despite the mud that would coat them within the hour. And somewhere behind the lines, the elephants were being perfumed. Imagine it again. A massive creature with skin like wrinkled tree bark, standing calm as handlers rub cedar oil into its thick gray hide. Frankincense smoke rises near its trunk. A paste of herbs is applied beneath its eyes to prevent flies. The tusks have been wrapped in leather for protection and perhaps charm, and a blanket bearing a Carthaginian insignia is strapped over its back. The scent wafts through the air, strangely out of place on a battlefield, like incense in a butcher's yard. But to the Carthaginians, this ritual was necessary. Elephants, like soldiers, had to be made ready, physically, mentally, and symbolically, because today they would not be cargo or companions. They would be warfare. The impact of a perfumed monster when elephants first appeared in Mediterranean battles. They were unlike anything the enemy had prepared for. Horses panicked. Lines broke. There were no drills for what to do when a wall of scent and hide and tusks charged toward you. But the elephants didn't always run. Sometimes they walked forward, steadily, deliberately. This was part of the strategy. A walking elephant, perfumed and armored, wasn't just a weapon. It was a message. It said, "We control nature. We command the beasts. We even calm them with oils and songs." And that message, for a time, worked. Elephants in battle, use and misuse. Carthaginian war elephants were typically deployed at the front of the line, particularly in early battles against Rome and rival African powers. Their job was to break enemy formations, trample infantry, and create confusion, especially among cavalry units. In theory, elephants were unstoppable. In practice, they were unpredictable. They were terrified of fire and sudden noise. They disliked uneven ground. They could trample friendly units. And if their handlers were killed, or simply if the scent routines were disrupted, they could panic still. For over a century, they were used with terrifying effect. At the Battle of the Trebia, 218 BCE, Hannibal's elephants helped rout Roman cavalry and crush the initial waves of resistance. Roman sources describe the sound of the earth shaking and the odd detail that they smelled of incense and tree oils. That detail may seem insignificant, but it was noted. Perhaps it stuck in the minds of terrified young conscripts. Perhaps it confused them. Why would monsters smell like a temple? To the Carthaginians, it was part of the mystique. A creature that smelt of sacred things walking into battle. Almost unbollet Hannibal and the Alpine ordeal, the most famous use of Carthaginian elephants. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps is often remembered for its boldness, its brutality, and its cost. Of the roughly 37 elephants he began with, only a handful survived the crossing. Many froze. Others slipped. Some simply lay down and refused to move. Despite cajoling and balm and all the fig cakes in North Africa, but those who did survive became symbols. Romans had never seen elephants in such terrain, and when one appeared, armored, perfumed, and still breathing after the Alpine trek, it shattered their sense of geographic safety. Elephants, after all, were supposed to belong to the east, to forests and deserts, not snow-covered passes. Hannibal used that dislocation to his advantage. Even if the elephants didn't win every battle, their presence made him seem unstoppable. And the scent, again, contributed to that illusion. Imagine being a Roman scout in the morning mist. catching a whiff of myrrh and crushed laurel in the breeze, and realizing an elephant was approaching through the Alps. What else, then, was possible? The fall of Carthage and the vanishing giants. So over time, Roman generals learned how to counter elephants. They used narrow formations. They built trenches. They trained cavalry horses to hold steady. Trumpets and fire were employed to frighten the animals. And eventually, elephants lost their edge. By the end of the Second Punic War, they were more of a liability than a strength. At the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's elephants failed to break Roman lines and caused chaos among Carthaginian infantry. When they panicked, it was the beginning of the end. Carthage would fall, and its elephant program along with it. The Romans, impressed but wary, occasionally used elephants in parades or ceremonies, but rarely in battle. They knew the risks, and the scented giant, once feared, became a memory. The handlers left behind what happened to the Mahaus, the keepers, the men who sang and rubbed balm into wrinkled skin. Most vanished from the records. They were not generals. They did not write memoirs, carried pouches of fig paste, and burned incense in the mornings. They were the first to know when something was wrong, the last to leave when an elephant collapsed from exhaustion. They whispered commands that only one creature could understand, and perhaps, in the quiet corners of post-war towns, they still kept bottles of cedar oil or crumpled rags that smelled faintly of the battlefield, not of blood or iron, but of perfume, a fragrance that lingers today. No war elephants roam the battlefield. Their species, the North African elephant, is extinct. The practice of perfuming animals for war has faded into obscurity. Traces remain in ancient texts, in Roman satirical poems mocking aromatic beasts, in Arab veterinary manuals quoting older traditions, and even in early Christian writings where the scent of myrrh is associated with calm, majesty, and control. The belief that elephants could be calmed by scent may seem absurd now, a bedtime curiosity, a soft detail in a brutal story. But perhaps that's exactly what it was meant to be, a reminder that even in war, humans reached for gentleness, but with balm and fragrance, that even a creature of war might pause at the scent of lemon balm, and maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. The Roman senator who refused to sit down, and what that meant for marble benches, a man of standing it, is early morning in Rome. Sometime in the 2nd century BCE, the sun has barely risen above the tiled roofs of the Forum, and already men are arguing, but not shouting. No, this is a different kind of argument, the kind that unfolds in layers of rhetoric and silence. in the nods and frowns of old senators wrapped in wool togas, leaning forward just enough to signal interest. Except for one man. He does not lean. He does not sit. He stands and has been standing quietly, stubbornly, day after day, in the same worn leather sandals, refusing to lower himself onto the carved marble bench behind him. The others look at him sideways. A few smirk. One young scribe whispers that he must have piles, but they are wrong. This senator has a principle, a superstition, and perhaps, just perhaps, a very stiff back. And because of him, a debate will soon begin about marble benches, leg fatigue, the symbolism of posture, and whether standing too long might be un-Roman. This is not a story about war, conquest, or emperors. It's a story about how long you can stand before someone makes it political. The benches of the Curian. The Roman Senate, or Curia, as it was formerly called. The physical structure of the room mattered nearly as much as the laws being discussed within it. Benches were arranged in rows along either side of the chamber, curving slightly to allow better visibility. The most senior members sat nearest the front, near the presiding consul or speaker. The benches themselves were made of polished marble, elegant, cold, and thoroughly uncomfortable. No cushions, no armrests, just stone and status. These benches symbolized Roman decorum. They were built to discourage slouching and long-winded speeches. In theory, they kept men alert. In practice, they caused an array of physical complaints. Some senators brought small woolen pads stitched by household slaves. Others shifted from one side to the other, trying not to look as stiff as they felt. A few simply endured. But one man, Gaius Porcius Licinus, a middle-ranking senator from an old plebeian family, took a different route. He stood, the standing senator Gaius. Porcius Licinus had a reputation for modesty and stubbornness. His family had once held a consulship generations before, but by the time of Gaius, they had faded from prominence. Gaius himself had no grand estates or famous victories. What he had was an opinion about dignity. According to a minor Roman historian named Flavius Lucanus, whose dusty scrolls survive only in fragments, Gaius once claimed that a senator should rise above the stone, not rest upon it. He believed that sitting dulled the senses, that the act of lowering oneself day after day into the same cold space made a man forget why he came to the forum in the first place. He began by standing for short speeches. Then he started standing for votes. Soon he stood through entire sessions, 4 or 5 hours at a time. Some thought it was a stunt. Others thought it a punishment. But Gaius insisted it was neither. "I stand because Rome still stands," he said once. "Let the benches rest. I shall not." The social implications of not sitting down in a culture as obsessed with ritual and symbolism as Rome, even the simplest gestures could carry meaning. To refuse to sit, especially in the Senate, was seen as more than eccentric. It was suspicious. Was it a sign of protest? An insult to the marblework donors? A subtle critique of the aging senators who could no longer stand that long? Soon, whispers began. Some claimed Gaius was mocking the elite, calling them soft. Others said he was showing off, positioning himself as a new kind of moralist. A few worried that he was trying to reintroduce Greek standing philosophy into Roman politics, a dangerous mingling of cultures, they thought. Of course, others simply rolled their eyes. One senator reportedly muttered, "He'll fall over eventually. Sooner if we keep talking." And maintenance, the unintended consequence of Gaius's stand-up style, was a renewed interest in the marble benches themselves, as younger senators began to imitate him, some sincerely, others ironically. The use of the benches decreased slightly, and with less use came fewer scuffs, fewer cracks, and fewer maintenance requests. This became a problem. The aediles, junior officials responsible for building upkeep, suddenly found themselves without justification for hiring laborers to polish or reface the benches. The stonemasons' guild lodged a quiet complaint. They had counted on regular work maintaining the marble dot. In response, a letter was circulated, allegedly from a minor official in the aedile's office, requesting that senators please make full and proper use of the seating structures so as to preserve traditional usage quotas. Yes, there was a quota for how worn a bench should be. Rome was, if nothing else, deeply bureaucratic. A minor motion. Eventually, one senator, Lucius Fabius Gallus, known for his sarcasm, proposed a motion. It wasn't a serious one, but it made it into the record that no man may stand for more than the length of 3 forum bells, lest he be counted as furniture. The Senate laughed. The motion failed, but it made Gaius Porcius Licinus smile. For the first and perhaps only time in the chamber, even mockery was a form of recognition. Standing and silence, there is no record of Gaius Porcius Licinus dying office, but one scroll dated from a decade after his last recorded vote notes that the benches are now again fully used, save for one left clear at the edge of the chamber. Perhaps it was a tribute, perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps it was just one worn marble bench kept clean in memory of a man who stood when others sat. In the next section, we'll explore how Gaius's peculiar habit influenced Roman attitudes toward public decorum, how standing became part of certain legal rituals, and how one stubborn senator accidentally sparked a conversation about class, comfort, and civic posture. Public posture and the politics of standing. You've seen him now. Gaius Porcius Licinus, standing resolute in the curving shadows of the Senate chamber. A man without extraordinary titles, wealth, or triumphs, but one who, for reasons known best to himself, decided to make standing his quiet legacy. And whether he intended to or not, he started a ripple. This section follows that ripple outward, beyond the marble bench and into the broader world of Roman decorum, civic symbolism, and the strange ways posture could reflect politics. Because in Rome, how you held your body, where you stood, when you sat, what you leaned on, wasn't just physical. It was public language, Roman decorum. More than just etiquette to the Romans, decorum meant more than politeness. It meant appropriate behavior according to rank, age, role, and occasion. A young man was expected to walk with energy, not arrogance. An older man with restraint but clarity. A general might ride on horseback, but only in full regalia, never lazily slouched. And a senator was expected to balance dignity with participation, to be firm, but not flamboyant. So, when Gaius chose to stand persistently, quietly, and without medical excuse, some interpreted it as decorum taken to extremes. It was oddly admirable, in the way that a man who refuses dessert at every banquet eventually earns praise, even if everyone else continues to enjoy honey. Cakes, standing as a legal gesture. Interestingly, the idea of standing already had ritual meaning in Roman life. In law courts, both the accused and the accuser were expected to stand during proceedings, especially while addressing the magistrate. Standing was a sign of seriousness, of bringing one's full attention and presence to bear. To sit during legal argument was disrespectful unless granted permission due to age or infirmity in public forums. Speakers always stood to deliver addresses. Even street orators used blocks or steps to elevate themselves. The higher the position, the more symbolic authority they claimed. So in some ways, Gaius Porcius Licinus was extending this symbol of attention and moral clarity into the Senate, the very place where decisions were made. But comfort often dulled attention. It was both deeply Roman and quietly revolutionary. When standing became style, the years passed, others began to follow Gaius's lead. Some, like younger senators, trying to curry favor with moralists, adopted partial standing, rising only for votes or key moments. A few radicals or posers, depending on whom you asked, attempted to stand for entire sessions, some even with staff in hand, trying to appear stoic and windblown, as if they had just descended from a mountaintop sermon. It didn't always go well. One junior senator, Marcus Vibius Cordo, attempted to stand for 6 straight hours during a debate on grain tariffs. Unfortunately, he fainted in the 3rd hour, fell backward into a scroll cart, and dislocated his shoulder. His colleagues helped him up, of course. Then one reportedly leaned in and whispered, "Even Gaius sat to eat." But the trend had taken root by the late 2nd century BCE. Senate proceedings began, including notes about standing durations, mentions in diaries, and the occasional satire from poets who mocked upright statesmen with crooked logic. The bench as a mirror of status. Meanwhile, the marble bench, that silent antagonist in Gaius's tale, began to take on new symbolic roles. Benches in the Senate chamber were eventually classified by degree of wear. The most polished seats became associated with the most habitual sitters, often elder senators who arrived early and stayed late. These smooth-seat senators, as one letter jokingly called them, were sometimes praised for dedication, and sometimes quietly mocked for having no other place to go. Meanwhile, the least used benches gained an odd prestige. When a senator rose in standing or favor, he might shift benches, not for a better view, but for a bench less sat upon. Clean marble suggested independence, or at least recent standing. Over time, new senators were occasionally assigned benches based not on rank, but on the balance of seat and stance. As one bureaucratic record awkwardly put it, thus, what began as a personal quirk became a measurable data point in the Roman furniture bureaucracy. Stoicism and the upright life, the philosophical movement of Stoicism, popular among Roman elites by the late Republic, may also have played a role in how Gaius's behavior was interpreted and imitated. Stoics prized self-discipline, bodily control, and moral clarity. The idea of a man refusing comfort for the sake of principle aligned neatly with Stoic ideals. Some even quoted Zeno and Cleanthes, early Stoics, to justify standing during debate, claiming the body should reflect the mind, active, alert, never slouched in the cushions of luxury. It's worth noting, of course, that there were no cushions in the Senate. But the metaphor worked. For a time, Gaius Porcius Laetinus became a kind of symbol, a man who made furniture into philosophy, ritualized standing eventually. Some elements of his standing practice were absorbed into minor rituals on days of mourning or remembrance. A few senators would stand in silence during opening remarks, during certain votes, particularly those on moral or legal matters, Junior members were encouraged to rise when they spoke, even if briefly. One senator, Publius Tullius Rufus, insisted on delivering all his non-budgetary remarks standing, claiming that the people deserved the full height of their voice. By the time of the late Republic, senators who stood regularly were no longer mocked, but categorized: standers, sitters, leaners, and so on. It didn't mean much, but it meant something. A small inscription years later, a marble fragment, was discovered near what may have been the home of Gaius Porcius Licinus. It bore a short inscription in neat Latin letters: Stetit pro Roma, sine gladio. He stood for Rome without a sword. It may have been added by a friend, or a student, or even an admirer. Or perhaps it was carved by Gaius himself in his final years, a small testament to a life spent upright, if not always uprightly powerful. Because not all acts of resistance are loud. Some happen in sandals, beside benches, untired legs. In the next and final section of this story, we'll examine how later generations remembered or forgot Gaius Porcius Licinus. We'll look at how his influence faded, reappeared, and quietly re-emerged in surprising corners of the Roman world, including law courts, military camps, and even bathhouse debates about proper posture. Memory, myth, and the marble footprint. By now, you've followed Gaius Porcius Licinus through the arc of his unusual stand, both literal and symbolic, inside the marble-walled quietude of Rome's Senate chamber. He never shouted. He never led armies. He never passed landmark legislation. But he did leave an impression, not on a monument, not in the forum, but in the seating charts and sore knees of Roman political culture. In this final section, we follow the fading and flickering legacy of his standing posture. We'll look at how history almost forgot him, then remembered him in fragments, sometimes reverently, sometimes comically, and often with curious misunderstanding. Because when you choose to leave, no legacy but your posture, you have to rely on others to sit up and notice. Posture in the shadows of empire after Gaius's death, likely quiet, unremarked, and entirely seated. His name slid gently off the ledgers of active Roman life. There were no statues or temples, no mosaics. For a while, he lived only in the memories of those who'd seen him day after day. Unmoved by the comfort of marble, a few younger senators tried to write about him, but their works were practical: notes on protocol, lists of senatorial traditions, some speculative bits on Senate discipline in one preserved letter. A certain Aulus Cassius Caldus wrote to his cousin, that old fellow who used to stand at the third column. Porcius something. He's gone now. Some say he never once took a bench in debate. Others say he only sat to eat plums. I prefer the latter. It feels more Roman. Even in the early decades after his life, myth was starting to outpace fact, memory. In Marblein, the early empire, under Augustus and Tiberius, the Roman Senate became increasingly ceremonial, more symbolic than functional. Standing for hours held less purpose. Comfort, deference, and order became the main goals. Yet oddly enough, architectural renovations of the Curia Julia included subtle references to Gaius's kind. One record notes a small, carved inscription beneath a Senate bench. For those who never sat. Was it a joke? A dedication? A placeholder? We don't know. But its existence suggests that some senator, somewhere, remembered. And in Rome, memory lived longest in stone. Philosophers, posture, and misreadings be the 2nd century CE. Stoic and Cynic philosophers had picked up fragments of the Gaius legend, though they often misunderstood it. Some claimed he stood to absorb the virtues of Jupiter through verticality. Others insisted he refused to sit because true Romans never sought rest during duty. A popular lecture series in Alexandria even referenced him during public debates about proper chair usage. A Stoic teacher reportedly said, "He who sits upon every stone finds no firmness. Be as Porcius Licinus, who made his spine a standard." Clearly, no one quite remembered the details, but his name had entered the catalogue of symbolic Roman behaviors. Alongside Cato's fasting and Scipio's quiet retreats, he had become a lesson, not a man. The mysterious footprint, one of the stranger archaeological finds associated with Gaius, comes not from Rome, but from a provincial Senate chamber in Gaul, dating to the late 2nd century CE. There, in the preserved floor tiles of a collapsed curia, was found a single, smoothed depression, a footprint worn into stone. Next to it, a fragment of marble bearing the name Porcius. No one knows if it's our Porcius or someone named in tribute, but local tradition and later medieval scribes claimed it was the spot where a provincial senator stood for 37 years, declining all benches and delivering his votes with upright stillness. Was it copycat admiration, a distant echo of Gaius's habit? Whatever the truth, his legacy had walked or stood far from Rome. The return of the standing senators later. During the late imperial period, standing behavior took on new meanings. In chaotic Senate sessions, as Rome struggled with civil strife and economic collapse, standing became associated with urgency or defiance. One 4th century historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, described a debate in which a senator named Priscus stood for an entire day to protest grain taxes. He reportedly invoked a Porcius of the old Senate as his example. No one in the chamber knew who that was, but a scribe wrote down the name, just in case. Rediscovery in dusty volumes by the Renaissance, as scholars unearthed old Roman texts and partial inscriptions. Fragments of Gaius's story reappeared. A 16th century humanist named Girolamo Santi compiled obscure Roman anecdotes. In one margin, he wrote, Porcius Licinus, a senator of iron spine, said to have stood in moral protest, or perhaps for comfort. Either way, his legs outlasted emperors. Santi was fascinated not by Gaius's politics, but his endurance. He even created a short Latin poem praising stillness without spectacle, noting that those who do not kneel or sit still bend time. The idea caught on in a few scholarly circles. Quietly, the standing senator became a metaphor for persistence, a final reflection. Why do we remember him? So why does a man like Gaius Porcius Licinus still linger in the corners of memory? Not because of power, not because of grand speeches, but because he refused to do something everyone else did without question. Not as protest, not as vanity, but simply as personal rule, a physical discipline that became quiet resistance. In a city of great orators and marble egos, he left no inscription but his own upright posture. That, perhaps, is what history is made of. Not just wars and laws, but the daily decisions we repeat until they become identity, like standing in a room full of sitters, or sitting when no one else dares to pause. And so, Gaius Porcius Licinus fades into the marble mist of time, not enshrined in legend, but present in every moment we choose stillness over comfort. In every instance where standing quietly speaks more than shouting ever could. Why ancient Carthaginians believed elephants, enjoyed perfume, the scent of the Sahariu, are standing, or more likely, reclining in the shade of a silk awning. On the edge of an ancient North African courtyard, the air is warm but dry, perfumed, faintly with crushed myrrh, cypress oil, and the ghost of last week's cedarwood incense. There is a distant lowing of animals, the kind of earthy, plodding creatures that carry the weight of Carthaginian ambition. And then you hear the heavy step of something much larger, something that snorts softly, flaps its ears, and rumbles from its belly like a distant summer storm. It's not a horse, and it's not a chariot. It is, of course, an elephant. And if you'd lived in Carthage around the 3rd century BCE, you wouldn't have found this strange at all. A city of traitors, schemers, and since Carthage was a place of transactional imagination, a city founded by Phoenician sailors and merchants, where spices were measured like coins and luxury oils were stored in amphorae, more precious than wine. Here, scent was not decoration, it was currency. Perfume signified power, piety, seduction. Even warfare, the city's elite bathed in rose water, anointed their temples with cardamom oil, and offered scented resins to their gods. And beyond. So when Carthaginians began using elephants in warfare, particularly the North African forest elephant, now extinct, it seemed almost inevitable that they would treat these enormous animals not just as beasts of burden or weapons of war, but as participants in ritual and beauty. And somewhere in that quiet fusion of function and reverence, a belief took root that elephants, especially the war elephants of Carthage, could be calmed, delighted, and perhaps even spiritually prepared by the gentle touch of perfume. Elephants and empire let. Step back for a moment. The Carthaginian military used elephants in a way that was both practical and psychological. These beasts weren't as large as today's Indian elephants, but they were agile, compact, and terrifying to Roman infantry, who had never fought an animal that could trample both man and spear alike. But unlike the brutish war machines of later times, Carthaginian elephants were often depicted with delicate adornments and even decorative bells. Some Roman chroniclers wrote that Carthaginian handlers, known as mahouts, would rub their elephants with oils before battle, not just to soothe their skin, but to prepare them emotionally. One fragment suggests they bring scent to its flank. The beast lifts its head and listens. Then it is ready. Whether this was poetic invention or a true observation, it hints at something deeper, the idea that elephants could recognize and respond to pleasant smells. Why scents? There are practical reasons, of course. North African elephants had sensitive skin and were prone to insect bites. Oils made from frankincense, camphor, or cypress could act as natural repellents. Mixed with beeswax or olive oil, they formed balms to protect against sun wounds or dryness. Handlers also observed that elephants responded strongly, sometimes aggressively, sometimes affectionately, to strong aromas, particularly citrus, spice, and smoke. Over time, a theory emerged that elephants had preferences. Some scrolls from Carthaginian colonies in Iberia mention particular mixtures: basil and fig oil, juniper resin, balsam of Thai Aru, and in one curious fragment attributed to the Greek writer Polybius, he notes, "The great beast of the Punic line, perfumed before its charge, behaves less erratically than when left raw." It's not a scientific observation, but it's history's first hint of animal aromatherapy. Perfume and ritualing Carthaginian culture. Everything sacred had a smell. Temples were drenched in incense smoke. Sacrifices were accompanied by oil libations, and festivals featured flowering. Garlands soaked in rosew. It's no surprise that elephants, animals that served both in war and in religious parades, were sometimes perfumed for ritual as well. During the feast of Melkart, some sources describe elephants draped in dyed fabrics and sprinkled with spiced oils as they processed through the city. Citizens offered them sweet cakes and tossed coriander and myrtle petals into their paths. This wasn't battle preparation. It was reverence. The elephant, in that moment, was not a weapon, but a vessel of divine strength. And scent was part of its sacred language. Did elephants actually like it? From a modern zoological perspective, elephants do indeed have a highly developed sense of smell. One of the most sensitive in the animal kingdom. They use scent to identify family members, detect predators, navigate over long distance, sense water, and food respond to emotional states in their herd. There are documented cases of elephants reacting curiously and positively to certain essential oils, particularly citrus, lavender, and mint in sanctuaries today. So while we can't know for certain how the Carthaginian elephants felt, it's not unreasonable to believe they enjoyed or recognized certain scents, and in a world without sedatives or veterinary care, calming rituals involving touch and scent might have been among the few ways handlers could bond with and soothe their enormous companions. A whispered belief, not a doctrine. It's important to understand that this belief that elephants liked perfume was never codified into doctrine. There are no surviving Carthaginian manuals declaring, apply 6 grams of oil to the left ear. Instead, the idea lived in gesture and practice, passed down among handlers, referenced in half-remembered lines from Roman soldiers, and etched faintly into the rituals of a fading empire. It wasn't science, it wasn't strategy, it was intuition, born of daily care and deep observation. And so we leave this first section of the story with a question, not a scholarly one, but a sensory one. What does it say about a civilization that prepared its war beasts not just with armor and commands, but with perfume? Was it vanity, compassion, spirituality, or just a way of saying, we see you and we honor even your joy? Handlers, hides, and herbal oils now. Picture yourself somewhere outside the Carthaginian city walls. You're beneath the dappled shade of tamarisk trees. The city lies behind you, a bustle of trade and argument, but here it is quieter. The land opens into a wide field where Carthage keeps her most peculiar soldiers, her elephants. They are not tame, not exactly, but they are not wild either. Each one is tended by a small team of handlers, men who do not march in formation or wear iron helmets, but who carry, instead, flax, hooks, and a curious blend of respect, caution, and affection. Let us now walk, slowly and sleepily, into the world of these handlers. The men who may have first taught the Carthaginians that elephants liked perfume, who were the mahouts. Though the term mahout is more commonly associated with India. In Carthage, these elephant handlers went by Punic names, long lost to history. We know them only by Roman approximations, elephantari, the beastmen. But in the military ledgers and temple rosters of Carthage, these individuals had a unique status. They were neither low-ranking servants nor high-ranking officers. They were something in between, specialists, trained from youth, often from the same families. For generations, they developed intimate knowledge of their assigned elephant, its temper, rhythms, fears, and favorites. They were known to walk beside the elephants instead of atop them, speak to them in low tones, sent to guide and calm them, mend. Perhaps most crucially, sleep near them during campaigns in war. A frightened or panicked elephant could do as much damage to its own army as to the enemy. And so, to maintain peace between man and beast, the handlers became perfumer. What did they use? Imagine the elephant not overwhelmed by it, but drawn to certain natural fragrances with curiosity and calm. Carthaginian handlers experimented with olive oil infused with bay leaves to cool the skin-bitter orange and lemon balm, crushed fresh and wiped onto ears and legs myrrh and balsam, rubbed along the trunk during moments of agitation, mint steeped in water, used to clean wounds and soothe cracked hide sand for celebration. Days, a mixture of rose water and honeyed cedar. A true luxuriate wasn't just about making the animal smell better. These mixtures served multiple purposes. They acted as insect repellents in the North African sun, helped mask the animal's scent from enemy dogs or scouts, soften and treat skin abrasions from wooden armor or chariot harnesses, created a ritual bond between handler and beast, a kind of aromatic handshake in later Punic temples. Votive tablets even showed elephants with small oil flasks carved beside them, an odd inclusion, unless oil was part of how Carthaginians understood the animal's care and symbolism. Elephants, in the eyes of the divine, to the Carthaginians, animals were never just tools. They were seen through a religious lens, woven into the larger framework of divine utility and natural obedience. Elephants, being large, rare, and hard to breed, were thought to be gifts from the earth gods, possibly connected to Baal Haman, the supreme deity of storms and fertility. Thus, Caring for elephants was not just military logistics. It was a sacred responsibility. Before battle, it's believed that priests might sprinkle incense, smoke around the elephant's feet, or offer flavored oils for the handlers to apply. One recovered inscription, badly weathered but still legible, refers to the blessing oil for the long beast to bring peace before the fray. While this may have been symbolic, it also likely had real, practical effects. Oils applied gently with linen cloth could relax tense muscles, mask unpleasant odors, and send familiar, calming signals to a nervous animal, just as a soldier might carry a charm or whisper a prayer. The elephant carried the touch of scented ritual into the noise of battle. Scent as language lit. Consider for a moment how elephants might have understood these practices. Modern science confirms that elephants have olfactory bulbs far larger than humans, use scent trails to communicate over miles, detect hormones, illness, and changes in emotion via smell can even tell when humans are stressed or calm by scent along Carthaginian handlers. Though they had no microscopes or neurology charts, may have noticed these responses through daily routine. They may have seen that rubbing a certain oil calmed an agitated elephant. They may have noticed that after a ritual bath with mint and olive, an elephant became more willing to approach crowds or less likely to trumpet anxiously. Over time, scent became a kind of unspoken dialogue, not just between animal and handler, but between animal and city, animal and gods, animal and destiny. Roman observers, skeptics, or admirers. To the Romans who fought and eventually defeated Carthage in the Punic Wars, these rituals seemed strange, even effeminate. They mocked the Carthaginian love of perfume, of spice, of foreign delicacy. But they also noted its effects in several Roman histories. We find accounts of elephants that advanced with tranquility during battle, turned not upon their own, seemed to obey the scented man more than the armed. Of course, Roman chroniclers were not above exaggeration. That scent, far from being ornamental, may have been a quiet, strategic tool, shaping elephant behavior in ways modern readers might overlook. The slow disappearance after Carthage fell in 146 BCE. The traditions of its elephant handlers began to disappear. The elephants themselves, the North African forest species, eventually became extinct. Some from overuse in warfare, others from habitat loss, others, perhaps, from simply not being understood after their caretakers were gone. Roman circuses used elephants too, but not with Carthaginian delicacy. There was little room for scented linen in the blood-soaked arena. What survived were fragments, oil recipes, figurines, vague Roman recollections, and the lingering belief that once, long ago, a civilization thought deeply about how to care for its animals, not through domination, not through fear, but through ritual, touch, and the gentle art of perfume. So now we come to another question. Quiet, half-formed, and lingering like scent on cloth. If the Carthaginians had survived, if their city had not been burned and salted, would they have passed this tradition on? Might we have known more about the ways elephants feel, remember, and even enjoy? Or was this always destined to be one of history's most delicate footnotes? The whisper that once elephants walked into war wearing the scent of bitter orange and myrrh, the last fragrance of Carthage. By the time the last elephant walked the harbor streets of Carthage, the city was no longer a place of commerce and command. Its ivory gates were cracked, its fountains stilled, and the scent of balm and oil no longer floated on the North African breeze. But before that quiet end, there was still a story, the final chapter of Carthaginian perfume, elephants, and the people who once believed they shared a bond deeper than war or trade. Let us walk one last time down the dusty pathways outside the city, where perfume jars were buried, handlers told stories, and a civilization prepared for its own fading. The elephants of Hannibal know. Tale of Carthaginian elephants can avoid Hannibal, the general who famously led a column of them across the Alps to attack Rome from the north in 218 BCE. What many forget, however, is how few of those elephants survived. Out of nearly 40 animals, only a handful, perhaps as few as one, made it through the brutal mountain terrain, the snow-covered cliffs, and the relentless Roman resistance. But one of them was remembered by name, Surus, meaning the Syrian, or possibly the southern one. He may have been the last and greatest of Carthage's elephants. Roman writers describe Surus not just as a beast of burden, but as Hannibal's companion, his elevated perch in battle, and possibly even his emotional anchor during the long, cold campaign in Italy. And once again, perfume enters the picture. Some records suggest that Surus wore dyed claws soaked in aromatic oils, not just as decoration, but to mask injury and prevent infection in the freezing cold. Handlers traveling with Hannibal likely carried pouches of fragrant resins pressed into paste and warmed by hand before application. Even amid the warfare and deprivation, they took time for ritual care. Surus, like many of the animals in ancient armies, wasn't just used, he was remembered. Elephant graveyards and the absence of bones you might expect, given their size and symbolic power, that the remains of Carthaginian elephants would be scattered across the archaeological record, but they aren't. No. Elephant graveyard has been definitively found near Carthage. No tusk fragments labeled with Punic script. No skeletons buried in temple walls. And yet, ancient texts insist they were there, used in war, paraded in festivals, trained near the city. So, where did they go? Theories abound. Some say they were buried at sea, their bodies floated out and sunk with stones and oils, in a kind of funerary release. Others suggest their bones were ritually burned, especially after military defeats, to prevent their power from being seized by Rome. A few believe that elephants were never native to Carthage and always imported, too expensive to keep long term. But the most poetic theory comes from a fragment of Punic writing translated awkwardly into Greek by a later scholar. The elephant, if treated as kin, must return not to the ground, but to the air. So the handlers gave it oil, fire, and silence. A kind of cremation, right? Perhaps, but it hints at something deeper, that elephants were seen as liminal beings in Carthaginian thought. Not fully beast, not fully divine, and that their deaths, like their lives, were marked by scent and ceremony, the fall of Carthage and the vanishing. Art when Rome finally razed Carthage in 146 BCE at the end of the Third Punic War. The temples were looted, the libraries burned, and the population enslaved or scattered. The elephant stables, if any still remained, were emptied, and the gentle knowledge of the handlers, passed down not through books, but through fingers, oil, and memory, vanished. No Roman school preserved it. No Greek physician described the exact methods of elephant soothing, the rituals of scent, the slow rubbing of balm on cracked gray skin, the careful mixing of myrtle and mint, the oiling of tusks before parade faded into silence. And yet, fragments survived. What remains? Perfume bottles and unspoken memories. 1932. Near the site of ancient Carthage, archaeologists uncovered a small terracotta flask shaped like an elephant's head. Inside were traces of resin and oil, still faintly aromatic even after 2 millennia. The recipe, reconstructed by chemists, contained mastic gum from the lentisk tree, laurel oil, likely for medicinal purposes, myrrh, the classic resin of solemn rituals, and a trace of saffron, rare. And expensive was it made for an elephant, or merely to honor one? No inscription answers that question, but nearby, a broken carving shows a human figure beside a large beast, not in battle, but in rest. The figure appears to be rubbing the animal's trunk with what looks like a cloth or sponge. It is not a scene of war. It is a scene of care, and it may be the last Carthaginian image of a handler at work, echoes in modern practice today. Elephant sanctuaries in Asia and Africa still use aromatic oils for care. In Sri Lanka, Kandala handlers sometimes apply coconut oil infused with herbs to the backs of working elephants in Kenya. Rescued elephants are occasionally washed with bitter aloe and wild mint, believed to soothe bites and calm nerves. And in India, temple elephants receive weekly baths in sandalwood water, their foreheads marked with scented paste. Are these practices ancient? Possibly, likely. They echo, at least distantly, what Carthage once knew. That scent is not just fragrance. It is memory, ritual, language, a way of saying to the animal, "You are not alone." The quiet legacies, so now you know the story. Battles or political speeches, but of linen rags soaked in citrus, of handlers crouched beside massive feet, of a civilization that watched elephants carefully and decided, they must enjoy this. They are calmer now. They must like it. And perhaps that's the simplest explanation of all. Not science, not magic, just a long, quiet observation by people who spent their days beside elephants, watching the flick of ears, the swaying trunk, the slow blink of eyes when oils were applied, and they believed that elephants enjoyed perfume, and maybe, on some level, the elephants did. Why medieval nuns collected dust in tiny bags and called it sacred dust from the corners of the world. If you were to walk into a medieval convent, not through the ornate stone doors of legend, but through a quiet side entrance near the herb garden, you might find a curious practice unfolding in the shadows of prayer. A nun, perhaps elderly and slow in her steps, would be kneeling beside a floor made of rough flagstone. In her hand, a small cloth, sometimes stitched with a cross or a scrap of Latin. In her other hand, a thin spoon, made of bone. She was gathering dust, not just sweeping it up, not discarding it, but carefully scraping, lifting, folding, and placing it into a tiny drawstring pouch, sometimes embroidered, sometimes sealed with wax, sometimes tucked into a hollow in the convent wall. She was collecting it because this dust was sacred, not metaphorically, but literally, was believed to carry the essence of saints, pilgrims, holy labor, or even martyrdom. It might have come from a corner where a revered abbess had died, or from under the bed of a nun who was said to sleep without dreams, or from the floor beneath the chapel where generations had knelt. Dust was not debris in the medieval mind. Dust was witness, the theology of dirt in modern thinking. Dust is associated with decay, the kind of thing we wipe off a windowsill and forget. But in the medieval imagination, dust was the residue of holiness. Christian scripture itself told them, "For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Genesis 3:19. To be dust was to be human, and to be surrounded by sacred dust was to be surrounded by fragments of human sanctity, skin cells of saints, bits of clothing, dried tears, trace elements of martyrdom. And so, medieval nuns believed that holy places left holy traces. Dust, therefore, became a devotional artifact in some convents. Dust from specific corners of the chapel was scraped annually and stored in tiny cloth pouches labeled pulvis, socer, sacred powder, in others. Nuns would gather the dust beneath visitors' sandals, especially if they were thought to be holy or learned, and preserve it for spiritual benefit. There are even records of convents requesting dust from Rome, from the Holy Land, or even from monasteries with revered abbots. These samples, sometimes smuggled in folded parchment, were added to the local collection, sprinkled reverently in corners, or blended into ink for copying scriptures. Yes, ink blended with holy dust. The words of the gospel written with the powder of pilgrimage. The bags themselves, what did these dust bags look like? They varied. Some were rough and practical, sewn from scraps of woolen habit or burlap, closed with a simple knot. Others were ornate, stitched with red or gold thread, bearing initials of abbesses or saints. A few convents placed these bags inside tiny reliquaries, the same kinds of containers used for bones, as if the dust itself were a second skin of holiness. And they weren't always stored away. Some nuns wore them around the neck, tucked inside tunics like amulets. Others kept them beneath pillows. A few were buried with their dust bags clutched in hand, as one might hold a rosary dot in a convent in Burgundy. A record from 1317 states, Sister Aveline kept the dust from the floor of the prayer hall, where the holy visitor, Father Iacobus, knelt and wept, for it bore the imprint of his knees. She kept it in a pouch sewn of his old cloak. Another from Flanders tells of a dust bag that contained ash and lint from the chimney hearth, because it was the hearth where 3 nuns had received visions while mending robes to us. This might seem quaint, but to them this was archive.dust, and the body in collecting dust. Medieval nuns were also performing a kind of spiritual anthropology, preserving the bodily imprint of communal holiness. Remember, this was a world without photography, without forensic memory, without digital permanence. If you wanted to remember where someone knelt, or wept, or confessed their fears, you could not take a picture, but you could gather the dust from the place they touched. This dust was not symbolic. It was literal presence. A French mystic named Hildegard of Tournai wrote, "In the dust of her corner, I found the memory of Sister Claire's grief. When I passed my hand across the floor, it came away dark, as if shadowed by sorrow. I placed it in linen." Modern historians believe such practices were a form of female record-keeping, especially in communities where literacy was rare or undervalued. While monks preserved doctrine, these women preserved space where grief had happened, where joy had occurred, where a nun had died in quiet devotion, where a candle had flickered during a vigil and left a stain of soot that no one cleaned, because to remove it would be to forget. And so the dust was gathered, bagged, named, and remembered. From dust to ink to prayer, one of the more intriguing practices associated with this tradition was the use of sacred dust in manuscript illumination. At the Abbey of St. Agnes, scribes would occasionally grind tiny amounts of collected dust into gall ink, the standard writing fluid of the time. This would tint the ink a slightly duller shade of brown, not visible to most eyes, but known to describe and sometimes marked in the margins. For example, these words are written with the dust of St. Beatrice's cell, or in this line is the breath of our candlelit prayers. Was this practical? Not especially. It likely made the ink more brittle over time, but was it meaningful? Absolutely. It fused text with place, word with world, faith with floorboard, and for a nun copying scripture by hand for 12 hours a day, the idea that her ink contained traces of those who came before, perhaps even saints. Quiet even as the centuries passed and convents were shuttered, burned, or repurposed. A few of these bags of dust survived in museum collections in France and Italy. You can still find tiny embroidered pouches labeled in faint Latin or Old French. Most are sealed, their contents uncertain, but when tested carefully and sparingly, these bags sometimes contain ash from candles' threads, from linen, habits pollen, from convent gardens, crushed bits of stone, from chapel walls and, yes, ordinary floor, dust mixed, layered, and held in cloth for hundreds of years. Not glamorous, not jeweled, but deeply devotional, and always quiet, because the nun who sewed the bag never intended it to be seen by the world. It was for her memory, her prayer, her need to keep sacred what might otherwise be swept away. So, the next time you find dust in the corner of a quiet room, consider this: it may be nothing, or it may be the softest record of presence of where someone once stood, or cried, or whispered, or prayed. The medieval nuns believed that even the smallest fragments could contain echoes of the holy, even dust. The rituals of dust and silence, the convent was not a loud place. Chatter was rare, laughter rarer still, and most hours passed in a hush broken only by the bell and the scrape of sandals against stone. But there were rituals, quiet ones, built not on spectacle but on detail. And among these, the ritual of collecting sacred dust formed a part of the convent's deeper memory. A secret liturgy of care. In some convents, it was done only once a year, often during Lent or on the feast day of a patron saint. In others, it might be done after a death, a vision, or a period of communal prayer. Always performed slowly, reverently, with a kind of deliberate stillness usually reserved for relics or last rites. It wasn't just about the dust. It was about who had touched that space, what had happened there, and what must not be forgotten. The ceremony of corners in the Abbey of Saint Madeleine in Provence, a record from 1246, describes a day called La Messe des Poussières, the Mass of Dust. It was not a formal mass in the ecclesiastical sense, but a local, internal observance kept by the nuns. On this day, the sisters would dress in their oldest robes, the ones already threadbare, and walk barefoot through the convent's oldest spaces, the original cloister, the abandoned storage rooms, the cracked chapel steps. Each would carry a small square of linen, pre-washed, stitched by hand. They would not speak. Instead, they would kneel at specific corners and thresholds marked in the convent's oral memory. Places where something holy or sorrowful had occurred. Some examples: A corner where a vision of Saint Agnes was said to have appeared in the dust near a water basin. Window ledge where Sister Catherine once prayed for 40 nights during a winter illness. The step where a novice once fainted from fasting and was revived. With broth and prayer in each of these places, the nun would press her cloth lightly against the floor or wall, as if to absorb not just dust, but the moment itself. Some would whisper brief lines of Latin, not prayers exactly, but verbal acknowledgments. Hic flevit, she wept here. Oravit, hic, she prayed here. Dormivit, in pace, she slept in peace. Once the dust had been gathered, the cloths were folded, tied with flax string, and taken back to a small cabinet known as the Armorium Memoria, the cabinet of memory. There, they would be labeled with a tiny strip of parchment noting the location, the date, and, if known, the person involved. None of this was done for public record. It was for the sisters, a system of quiet, sensory archiving of lives that would never be canonized, but which deserved, in the eyes of their sisters, to be remembered. Dust and authority. Curiously, not everyone could collect sacred dust in many convents, the task was assigned only to senior nuns or those designated as custodians of memory. This was not an official ecclesiastical title, but rather a role conferred by the abbess to someone particularly observant, careful, and often elderly. The custodian's job was threefold: to recall the spiritual geography of the convent, where events happened, where visions were reported, where sorrow or joy had occurred, to preserve the dust in appropriate ways, usually by transferring it to clean cloth or keeping it dry with herbs like lavender or rosemary, to share stories associated with each place to the younger nuns. Often during the winter months, when work slowed, these women became the oral historians of the community, and their bags of dust were the physical footnotes. One such custodian, Sister Marcellina of Parma, left behind a partial register of her collection in the margins of a psalter. It reads like a whispering inventory: dust from the western stairs, where Sister Theodora fell and forgave her pain; soot from the ceiling over the novitiate hearth, where the dove appeared; gray matter from the infirmary curtain, where prayers for rain were answered. These entries tell us almost nothing by modern standards, and yet they tell everything. They map emotion and memory. They chart the life of a place, not in architecture or record books, but in particles, the unsweepable fragments of sacred presence. The smell of dust has a smell. Anyone who has lived in an old house or opened a trunk in a musty attic knows it. It is not always pleasant, earthy, sometimes sour, sometimes warm, like sun-baked stone. But to the nuns, the scent of sacred dust was one of devotion. In some convents, bags of collected dust were infused with crushed petals from chapel flowers, or dried leaves from the garden, not to perfume it in the modern sense, but to preserve it, to keep it from rotting or mildewing. Lavender was most common, followed by rose, marigold, and sometimes hyssop, mentioned in the Bible for cleansing. Occasionally, the nuns would add small shavings of beeswax or burned parchment. This meant that when the dust was opened for use in a manuscript, or to be buried with a dying sister, it gave off a gentle, ritualized smell, a smell tied to the body, to memory, to prayer. Even now, some museums that hold these ancient pouches report a faint, lingering scent, a blend of fabric, ash, and crushed herbs, faint, faded, but still alive. When dust was lost, fires, raids, reformations, fires, raids, reformations, and simple time destroyed many convent archives. In some cases, entire cabinets of sacred dust were tossed out by new regimes that saw them as superstitions or unhygienic clutter. But the stories sometimes remained, even when the bags were gone. One account from a German convent in the 1500s tells of a nun who tried to hide the community's most cherished dust pouch by sewing it into the hem of her cloak. She was caught and scolded by a bishop's envoy, who declared, "Dust is for the broom, not the altar." But even after the cloth was burned, the sisters continued to observe its day of collection, remembering not the physical dust, but the devotion behind it. In this way, the ritual of dust became portable, no longer dependent on the object, but carried in memory, practice, and story. Dust itself, after all, was not eternal, but the act of caring for it that lingered sacred, but never shown like relics of saints, which were sometimes gold-encrusted or paraded through town. Sacred dust was never flashy. It was always private, even secret. Some believe this was a reflection of female spirituality in the Middle Ages, deeply embodied, rooted in the physical, but quiet, non-authoritative, and often overlooked by the male ecclesiastical hierarchy. Dust, after all, had no relic value in Rome. No one wrote sermons about it. It didn't perform miracles, but in the day-to-day life of cloistered women, it connected the body to the divine. It was the residue of the real. So, imagine this: a winter morning in 14th century France. A nun, wrapped in a patched wool robe, kneels in the corridor between the chapel and the kitchen. She presses a square of cloth to the floor and waits, not to clean, but to remember. She is not gathering evidence. She is gathering presence. She is not preserving a miracle. She is preserving a moment. When the dust settled, how the ritual faded, and what remained by the late 1600s, convent life in much of Europe was changing. The great wave of monastic reform had swept through many orders. Simplicity, obedience, and stricter orthodoxy became the new ideals. Bishops were inspecting nuns' libraries. Spiritual traditions that couldn't be easily explained or footnoted in Latin theology were quietly discouraged. And so, the practice of gathering sacred dust began to fade. Not all at once, not as a formal rule, but gently, like the practice itself slipping out of use, one convent at a time. A quiet disappearancing like major reforms, the closing of monasteries, the banning of certain relics, or the standardizing of liturgy. The fading of sacred dust left almost no formal trace that it wasn't outlawed. It was simply no longer taught. New novices weren't told which corners to kneel in. The Armoram Memoria was left unopened. The linen cloths, once lovingly folded, were forgotten in old drawers. Some convents likely threw them out during cleanings. Others may have placed them, unmarked, into burial chambers, final offerings to memory. But in rare cases, the tradition persisted, not as a physical practice, but as story. In a 1731 letter from a nun in the Abbey of Marienthal, in Alsace, we read, "There is a tale the elder sisters told of cloths tied with string and filled with memory. Places where the floor had once wept or the wind had carried voices. I never saw them, but I walked softer in those halls." That's what remains of the ritual, not the dust, not the cloth, but the idea that a space can hold memory and that caring for that memory matters. The rise of order and cleanliness, part of the reason sacred dust rituals disappeared, had to do with changing ideas of cleanliness by the Enlightenment. The cultural view of dust had shifted. No longer a sacred remnant, it was a health hazard, a sign of disorder or neglect. Medical theory, influenced by humoral and miasma models, now connected dust with disease. Spiritual traditions that embraced dust, ashes, soot, crumbs, earth, were increasingly suspect. A 1792 ecclesiastical treatise from Florence even warned, "Let not our houses of worship harbor dirt in the name of piety." Cleanliness is a form of discipline, and disorder a temptation. Even if the author didn't mean to target sacred dust rituals directly, the message was clear. Spiritual practices should align with visible order. The age of silent dust collection, of quietly placing a linen cloth on a stone floor and calling it prayer, was out of step with the new era of rational devotion. Did any dust survive? Strangely, yes, at least some of it. In 1994, researchers cataloging early medieval convent materials in Bavaria discovered 3 small linen bundles tucked into a box of forgotten devotional books. Each was labeled in cramped 13th century handwriting. The inscriptions read, "From the wall beside Sister Annika's window, from the hearth of the novices, from the place of silent prayers." They were wrapped carefully and tied with ancient string, now yellowed and stiff. Inside was a soft, grayish substance, hard to identify, but almost certainly dust. Testing revealed the dust contained traces of ash, wool, fiber, human skin cells, and herbs, primarily lavender and hyssop. In short, it matched the composition of other described sacred dust rituals. The bundles are now kept in a climate-controlled drawer in a university archive. They are not displayed, they are not venerated, but they exist, and perhaps that's enough. What the dust taught, so what, in the end, did this practice give to the women who kept it? It wasn't doctrinal clarity, it wasn't social prestige, and it certainly wasn't public recognition, but it gave them a system of attention. To dust is to notice the smallest things. To kneel and collect it is to admit that the ordinary holds. Memory, that the footstep, the sigh, the teardrop that dried before anyone noticed mattered. That nothing truly is insignificant in modern terms. We might call it embodied memory, a form of spirituality rooted not in sermons, but in space, not in miracles, but in moments, echoes in modern practice. Interestingly, some aspects of the dust ritual echo in present-day practices, often unconsciously. Some nuns in enclosed convents still walk barefoot through certain parts of their cloisters during Lent, to feel the cold stone as a form of humility. In Japan, Buddhist monks sometimes collect dust from the feet of the dying, placed in cloth and used during memorial rituals. In certain folk Catholic traditions in Spain and Portugal, dust from a pilgrimage route is gathered and placed under a pillow for protection. During sleep, these aren't direct descendants of the medieval nuns' practice, but they carry the same impulse to find meaning in the smallest, most overlooked traces of life, to say, this space held sorrow, this floor carried prayer, this dust is sacred. A final image. Let us return once more to the cloister. It's a spring morning in 1274. A nun kneels by the worn stone threshold where dozens of sisters have walked, laughed, wept, and grown old. She presses a cloth to the floor, not to clean, but to listen. And somewhere, centuries later, someone finds that cloth. They don't understand its full story. To keep the dust, and in doing so, kept a memory alive.